And good hello again. This is actually the final video that is focused really around THL2601, although it's sort of a bit of a cap-off. So we're going to jump straight into it, but my name is LC Lupus, or at least that is the name I go by, and this is my little series about lecture stuff. So let's jump straight on into it. So today I'm looking at just the idea that literary analysis is interdisciplinary. So, right, if something's interdisciplinary, it means that it can look at multiple disciplines. It doesn't mean all disciplines, but multiple disciplines. So we're just going to have a bit of a look at that and how that also kind of relates to semiotics in general. So remember semiotics, now there is a video that goes into semiotics more in depth, but just as a quick refresher, and I'm going to be using the Saussurean semiotic model, seeing as it is the one most commonly used in literary theory. So yeah, just going to use that. So when it comes to literary theory and semiotics, we have this idea of that there is a signifier, which is a thing, so a word or an image. And then the signified, which is what that thing means. And that can be variable, and it can change according to the culture that produced it, and all sorts of things like that. Like that is essentially what semiotics is. And it's a way of analyzing meanings based on cultural ways of looking at things. So that is best understood when you also do know about a lot of other disciplines, because you can only truly understand a text when you know what all it could be referencing in many ways. So, a text, generally speaking, you'll be looking at the form, the content, and the context of a text. So remember, text is also a catch-all term. Text refers to any number of things that could be literary in some sense, or even not necessarily literary if we do decide to look at something from a non-literary perspective, to, for instance, instead look at something from to look at, like, say, a picture, a painting, something like that. But we're looking at literary stuff because this is literary analysis, obviously. So the form, right, is the things like the language, the book itself, the use of grammatical symbols, all those kind of things. That is the form. The form is the actual thing that you are engaging with. And through the form, you can find the content. So what is the form about? What is the book about? So let's say if it was a book, right? The form would be the book itself, the use of language, like what language is used, how is that language used, how does it use grammatical symbols, how does it separate things into paragraphs, blah, 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 blah. The content is, what is that book actually about? See, so those are sort of seen as the two sort of dual sides of it. But now, they do inform each other. They are connected to each other. You can't have content without form. You could have form without content, but that would just be like nonsense words. So, and even then, you might still say that is, if you look at someone like the work of Lewis Carroll, who produced a lot of nonsense poetry, it does still have meaning in it. It's just produced in a nonsense way. It could be, imagine a poem that is just made to sound nice but means nothing. Then is not the meaning that it's supposed to sound nice. So form and content are kind of always connected to each other. You can't really have one without the other. Now, the context is everything that is around the text, right? Who wrote it? What society existed around which it was written? So those are things like who was it that wrote it in the first place, the people around it, the society around it, the political beliefs of people at the time, or prevalent political beliefs, all sorts of things like that, all form the context of a text. Now, when it comes to interdisciplinary stuff, it is kind of the context. You understanding the form and the content through understanding the context of things. So we're going to go into a couple of these as just a quick overview of things. So different things that you could look at, and things that you should, or, to better understand a text, you should understand these things so that you can better understand the things. So I'm just going to briefly look at history, philosophy, psychology, linguistics, sociology, economics, and critical theory. Now, these are not the only disciplines. There's obviously many, many more disciplines. And, for instance, there's a book by Bessie Head called When Rain Clouds Gather, which actually incorporates a lot of agriculture into it. So if you understood agriculture, there are certain things that you might understand better than someone who doesn't. I don't know agriculture very well. So to me, it was all very strange and different and whatever. To someone who knows it, they might be like, oh, this is quite interesting because look, it's actually talking about farming and stuff like that. And I know that stuff, so I understand it more. So that is something that when you're analyzing something, if you have that kind of information, you can then talk about that information with regards to the text as a whole, right? So let's say history. There's lots of books incorporate history. I've just put here, for example, Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. Now, that is by far not the only person that has written something that incorporates historical information. Historical information can be found anywhere. Imagine a text that is set in during the Renaissance. Well, if you understand the Renaissance, you're going to better understand the text, right? So in terms of Catch-22, it's set in World War II, and it's set during, the characters are part of the Allied nations, and they are flying, and they're part of the Air Force, so they're basically flying missions, missions that are extremely dangerous and missions that they might die on. So that's quite hectic stuff, but if you don't know anything about World War II, then you might really struggle to understand what they're talking about. However, if you were to be analyzing this, right, writing an essay about it, you could then talk about the history of that period and how it relates to the book itself. What things does it do right? What things does it do wrong? Is it properly historical, or is it kind of screwing it up? There are so many different ways to look at history. And history, when depicted in a narrative, is not necessarily always going to be accurate. If it is or isn't accurate, why is it or is not being accurate? Why is it doing the way it's doing things? So now, let's say philosophy. The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco is a book that is full of philosophical ideas and thoughts. It's a highly intertextual text. There are parts where they will sit you down and kind of talk about philosophical texts. A major part of it is the work of Aristotle, for instance. Now, I'm not going to spoil the ending, obviously, but if you are familiar with Aristotle, then the ending, the climax of the book, becomes much more significant because you understand the philosophical implications of what is depicted in that narrative. So understanding philosophy can help you to understand The Name of the Rose. And then let's jump to psychology, right? A short story called The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, which is about the depiction or the treatment of people who are mentally ill, specifically the treatment of women who are mentally ill. Now, psychology doesn't mean mental illness, but mental illness is part of psychology. So it's one component part of it, but there are many different component parts of it. But if you understand the history of psychiatric attention and what have you during that period, sort of the late 1800s and early 1900s, you will better understand the kinds of ideas that were being expressed there and why they were being expressed, right? Understanding psychology and psychiatry can help you to understand that text. In something like 1984 by George Orwell, which is has a great interrogation of linguistics, because there is a thing in it called Newspeak, which is a kind of created language that is an adaptation of English by removing certain words and phrases and ideas, and through the removal of words, ideas, expressions, etc., you can actually limit thought. So, for instance, if you can get rid of the word freedom, and so the word freedom no longer exists, how do you express the concept of freedom? It's an interesting philosophical, linguistic, I don't want to give things away, it's an interesting linguistic concept, the removal of language. So then what about sociology? Something like The Cherry Orchard by Anton Chekhov, which is a play. And the thing is, that play depicts the changing that occurred, the sort of changing of the sociological landscape of Russia that took place after the abolition of serfdom. So, there's also some history there, but it looks at how society changed because of those things that happened, where the old aristocracy started to kind of weaken and fall away in favor of this new rising middle class, and sort of people who had become rich through their own means rather than people who were born into wealth. So it sort of shows the changing of class dynamics within Russia at the time. What about economics? Something like Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. That book is about basically free market capitalism. So it explores that concept of capitalism, and it's become a major text for people who have, libertarian and conservative ideals. So it has become a major text there. But now there can be an economics text that looks at other things from a left-leaning perspective or a more centrist perspective or something like that. But economics can form part of. So if you understand, sort of capitalism and free marketeerism, you will better understand Atlas Shrugged and other works by Ayn Rand. But not going to get into it in any real depth. Then something like, say, critical theory. Critical theory is things like, it's all sorts of things. Feminism, Marxism, animal studies, all of these kind of things are incorporated under the general idea that is critical theory, which are generally theories that in some way critique society. They are critical of society. So critical theory. Yeah. So something like, say, The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter, which is a collection of short stories that are thematically connected to one another. The texts are not actually connected to each other, but they are connected through theme. So they often explore feminist ideas and ideas of things like change by essentially being rewrites, but more so reinterpretations of certain fairy tales. It's basically reinterpretations of a variety of fairy tales. Things like Bluebeard and I think, because I can't remember all of them very well, but there's like Bluebeard is in there, and things like, I think, like Hansel and, actually I don't think Hansel and Gretel, but things like Beauty and the Beast, reinterpretation of Beauty and the Beast is in there, usually then focusing on feminine characters and femininity in general. So there's some things in there that then, if you understand those concepts, you will better understand The Bloody Chamber. See, so that is the idea there, that you start to understand these things better when you're forced to encounter them in this particular sense. So, that's the idea there. Now, as you might tell, because also I slipped up sometimes on purpose, sometimes not, that these concepts also intermingle with each other. So let's say, for instance, I'd said history, Catch-22, Joseph Heller. That book is also quite philosophical. And it interrogates the psychology of soldiers. So it's actually interdisciplinary. It looks at all of these things, history, psychology, sociology, these things together. Something like, let's also say Atlas Shrugged. Atlas Shrugged has economics, but it also looks at sociology and philosophy. And history, I suppose. And you can also look at something like 1984. 1984 is very much influenced by Stalinism, which requires an understanding of history. So, like, understanding also psychology and sociology. It looks at, like, class dynamics and all sorts of things. So if you can understand all of these different things, you don't have to know all of them. But the more widely read you are, the better you'll be able to analyze a text. So if you know more things, you will be a better reader. That doesn't just mean that you can read well, but like if you know your history and you know your psychology and you know your philosophy and you know your economics and you know your sociology, you know your critical theory, blah, 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 whatever, you can better appreciate texts that incorporate those elements into it. So when you're analyzing a text of any description, really, when you're analyzing a text, you can incorporate those sorts of ideas. And it's also good to understand that no one text will ever explore all of it. They just won't. They will not look at one thing, and they will not look at all the things. There are texts in which you cannot discuss philosophy. There are texts in which you cannot discuss history. There are texts in which psychology is not incorporated, etc., etc., etc. But you can find the times in which those things are used and when they are not used, and you can interrogate those things. Also, of course, what is not said can often be just as important as what is said. So let's say a text that has characters who, let's say something like, random, The Simpsons, right? The Simpsons, they're portrayed as a middle-class family. They're often portrayed actually as kind of like middle and even sometimes lower middle class. But the thing is, Homer, the father, for those who don't know, Homer Simpson, he is like a nuclear engineer. That is not the kind of job that gets you like a poor... You're not like poor if you have a job like that. And also their house is pretty big, like when you see the images of it. Now, when that series first aired in 1989, that home was seen as much more middle class. Nowadays, that is seen as probably quite like a more luxurious house. The idea about what is working class, what is middle class, what is upper class has shifted, right? So when they don't change the house and the house looks exactly the same in 2023, it represents something different. It is different to what it was before. It has actually changed. So you can look at the negative space, what isn't said, just as much as you can look at what is said. Because, yeah, it's variable. So what is that? Like, look at The Simpsons. What does that tell us about how economics and sociology, like class dynamics, how has it shifted in the 30-odd years since season 1 came out? How have things changed? When you look at an old story set ages ago, how is it different to today? What has changed that has not been stated? So you can look at many, many different things when it comes to literature. And that's what I've been trying to explore here. And all of these can also be looked at from a semiotic perspective, right? Understanding the signs. So say, for instance, a big house versus a small house. What does it indicate about people and how they have changed over time? It's an interesting potential query to look at. You know, why has this thing happened versus another thing? How has it changed? How has it shifted? How is it new? How is it different? How is it the same? And what does that indicate about the society that produced it, the society that consumes it, the society in general? All of these things are interdisciplinary. So the more you understand about the world, the better you can understand texts, because texts are written by real people who live in the real world. This is also the idea that when people say, oh, they want their stories or whatever to not have politics in them. That is impossible. If you have characters who are living comfortably and so they're able to, say, pursue romantic, ideas, that says something about the economic position of those people. Now you might say, oh, but you're reading too much into it. No, but you're not. If there's a story, say a book, in which there's romance, and the book is just about romance, how is it that these characters have the money and the time necessary to pursue romance as a major part of their life? Whereas what about people who don't have the time, energy, whatever, to pursue romance to the same degree? What does it say about society as it's depicted versus how it really is? This is why when you look at a lot of, say, these old texts that will be about, like your Pride and Prejudices and stuff, those people were aristocrats. They had money, they had wealth, they had the time to faff about and be like, oh, I'm going to decide who I ultimately am courted by, who I fall in love with. Whereas in the real world, people often get married because of other reasons, or they don't have the time to have these lovely, amazing, romantic tales about them. But what does that tell you about the text that does or does not depict those things? So that is what you want to look at when it comes to analyzing a text. What does the text say? What doesn't the text say? And what does the text say by not saying things? What does it take for granted? And what doesn't it take for granted? A very, very basic thing. This is because I studied a field called animal studies. And my master's is in animal studies. It's in literature, but it's in animal studies as it relates to literature. So, when you're watching a movie, reading a book, anything, characters will just sit and eat meat. And it's not a commentary, it's not saying anything, they're just eating food. However, it does say something about society that we can just say, oh yeah, they're just eating food, but they're eating meat, which means that they have decided that meat is fine and normal to eat. It's just become part of the background. It's not interrogated. Whereas, for instance, if they were eating human meat, all of a sudden it would become something to focus on. So that is something that is worth looking at in this regard. Why are things background information? Why do we take them for granted? Or why do we not take them for granted? And that's pretty much, literary analysis as an interdisciplinary sort of field. And that's the end of it. So if you enjoyed this, like, comment, subscribe, do the things. I've been LC Lupus, as per usual. And if you did like this and want to support this stuff, you can also buy my books. The latest one is Flesh Zone Blues, which is a cyberpunk story set in a dystopian world in which all regulations do not exist. We have figured out a way to monetize heaven, and it's mostly just miserable and sad and terrible all the time. Like the real world. So if that sounds like something that could potentially be interesting to you, check out the link in the description below. I have other books down there too, but I'm only focusing on Flesh Zone Blues because it's the latest one. So otherwise, have a great day, week, and month ahead, and ta-ta.